As for the ministers in the presidency, I'm trying to think back when last there was a minister in the presidency of any kind that was effective.
The reshuffle that wasn't, or could we learn more from this most recent cabinet reshuffle by President Ramaphosa? Joining me to unpack a bit and make sense of the wider context and the wider issues around this reshuffle, I'm joined by freelance journalist Ivo Vegter. Ivo also writes weekly columns for the Daily Friend. I will link to his latest columns in the description below. Ivo, thanks very much for your time with us today. Just to focus a bit on the details of the latest reshuffle, I'm going to use that word even though I don't personally believe it was much of a reshuffle in terms of ideology or policies, maybe in terms of some personnel, as it were, some sort of personalities. But just your thoughts on the details of the latest reshuffle, and then we can get into maybe some of the policy implications.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thanks for inviting me on. I called our president feckless, and I called his cabinet bloated and self-serving. And what I mean by that is that none of what he did was in the interests of South Africans or the South African economy. Even when it appeared that he did things in the interest of South Africa, like appoint an electricity minister, it really was all about himself. Now, the reason I say that is he basically he dealt with his enemies, and he dealt with them in different ways. Lindiwe Sisulu, for example, he kicked right out of cabinet. But Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, he basically recalled to the union building so she can sit in the creche all day and he can keep an eye on her. So he's sort of dealt with his enemies, and then he strengthened his cabinet from the perspective of people who supported him in his re-election campaign in December last year. So that's where the Ramakgopas come in, for example. Josienso Ramaphosa, who's got the nickname Sputla, is an interesting appointment. He is an engineer by trade, civil engineer, although he seems to have specialized more in transport engineering. And he's also got a few additional degrees in business and politics or whatever that take him up to PhD level. So he's qualified on paper. The only experience that I could find that he has with electricity, however, is when he was the mayor of Tshwane. He got involved in a very dodgy tender to supply smart meters. And there was over between 100 and 200,000 smart meters that they were acquiring for somewhere north of R1 billion. Only about 16,000 of them eventually were installed, which works out to a net cost per unit of about 160,000 rand. Pravin Gordhan had actually strongly recommended him against that tender, against doing that deal. He ignored Pravin, but eventually the deal was cancelled. It was basically wasteful expenditure. So this seems to be the sum total of his experience with electricity. Now, if you look at Eskom, dodgy tenders is Eskom's problem. So I'm not exactly sure what Sputla Ramakgopa really brings to the party there.
Ivo, just your thoughts on maybe the sort of increased bureaucracy or the centralization of control in the presidency. So a trend that we've seen throughout the different iterations of the Ramaphosa administrations, cabinets, that sort of thing. People, you've got this frustration, rightly so, with the status quo, and nothing really seen being done. But I wonder about the risk of, okay, fine, get someone who get things done, but they might not get things done in a way that respects maybe civil liberties, for example, or economic freedoms. If you get this, action man, sort of strong man kind of thing. Do you think there's any risk of that now that Ramaphosa has added to the number of ministers in the presidency, but also, again, increased the size of the cabinet, despite, of course, promising to trim that fat a few years ago?
Yeah, let me address the second part first about the size of the cabinet. He, in his speech on last Monday, he said that they were working on a proposal to reduce the size of cabinet, right? And he was all promises, right? But in the meantime, they were going to increase it because that's what you do when you're trying to reduce the size of cabinet. You first increase it just a little bit because people have to eat. The truth of the matter is that he's had a proposal on his desk for 4 years. Right, to reduce the size of the cabinet to 22 people, 22 cabinet ministers. Right, he has not implemented that. He's outright lying. his intention is not at all to reduce the size of cabinet. It is, for that matter, it isn't at all to reduce corruption either. I mean, otherwise he wouldn't have appointed Zizi Kodwa. You know, can you imagine how Judge Raymond Zondo felt swearing in Zizi Kodwa when just about a year ago he recommended Zizi Kodwa for criminal prosecution? You know, so the idea that he's acting against corruption and that he's reducing the size of government and that he's making it more efficient, all of that is nonsense. All of that's just window dressing. You know, it's all about strengthening the ANC's position ahead of the next year's election, and strengthening his own position within the ANC. That's what all of these appointments are about. As for the ministers in the presidency, I'm trying to think back when last there was a minister in the presidency of any kind that was effective at doing anything. You know, I mean, they've got the Minister for Women and other disabled people, is what I like to call it, because I think it's insane that women are lumped in with disabled people. You know, they got that presidency. What has that ever done? You know, nothing other than hand out a few awards and pat each other on the back and, you know, make boring speeches on Women's Day. These ministries in the presidency really don't do very much. It's, you know, it's a way to keep loyal ministers close to the presidency, I think. You know, to basically just fortify. What's the word? What's the word I'm looking for when you put soldiers in a building? You garrison the union buildings. That's really what he's done.
And Ivo, just in terms of wrapping up, everything sort of taking place now in the context of the general election that should take place by the latest August of 2024. Are you seeing anything from the ANC realizing just how bad things are on the ground, you know, for people who can't, for example, afford generators and water tanks and everything like ministers are, you know, are given provision for? Any sort of acknowledgement of those challenges and that they need to change things from the inside? Or do you think it's more a case now, let's just keep those people in who have been in up until this point in time, try and mitigate the losses as best as we can at the voting booth, and sort of then try and move on from there?
Oh, look, I think they'll try to mitigate the losses mostly by the sort of subtle bribery techniques, the vote buying techniques that they've been doing all along. You know, they'll extend the social relief of distress grant. They'll make some more noises about the NHI, although I have a funny feeling that they're starting to realize that this is way outside of what they can actually achieve. But, you know, if they make promises about free healthcare and free this and free that, then they're probably hoping that the sheep will vote for them. You know, I've seen several surveys. One survey that doesn't get the ANC under 50%, but several that do, and significantly under 50% in the next election. The one concern that I have, though, is that, well, besides for the fact that coalition government is really, really messy, you know, and you can get very small parties that could literally bring down a president whenever they feel like it. My other concern is that the ANC will very likely retain control of the National Council of Provinces, which means that a lot of legislation that affects the provinces, and there's a lot of that, you know, there are a lot of subjects on which the provinces need to consent. They could throw back at Parliament, and if Parliament wants to override them, they would have to do so with a 2/3 majority vote. So they could become, the NCOP could become a real spoiler in any prospective post-ANC government, you know, should that come to pass. I'm not getting my hopes up too high that we will see a post-ANC government, though. I think it's perfectly possible that the ANC could somehow either retain power or lead a coalition, you know, if it comes to that, to stay in power.
Thank you very much for watching. I do think as we head toward the elections, there's an increased risk of that sort of power and centralization within the presidency being used to further the control and access to resources of the ANC, as they perhaps realize that they're going to perform very badly in those general elections. But let us see how things play out. Thanks very much for your time. Remember, before you leave, like this video and also subscribe to our channel if you have not yet done so. We also invite you to follow our work on our website, which you can find linked in the description below. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.